Well, welcome to another presentation. Today, what we're going to look at is really two topics that kind of lead into one another. So, what we're going to look at first is how America industrialized in the early part of the 19th century. This is also called the Market Revolution. Then we're going to jump over to the reactions to the market revolution. And the major reaction to the market revolution is the antebellum reform movement. So it might sound like these are totally different ideas. I mean, one is economic and talking about how we industrialized, and the other is really social and is talking about all these different reform movements that want to fix problems in America. But really, causally, one does influence the other. The antebellum reform movement is a result of the changes that happen as America moves into a market economy. Well, as always, it's a good idea to have a question in mind, especially when you're looking at a topic as big as this one. So our question for this presentation is describe the ways in which the early 19th century industrialization transformed America. And to answer this question, you have to do two things. You have to not just talk about the industrialization changes. You can't just talk about all the things that happened that changed our country and moved it in a more industrial direction, which is what I'm talking about in the first part of this presentation. But you also have to talk about how that transformed America. So you have to look at all the reactions to industrialization and explain those as well. So even though this might look like a more basic question because you're not making a analyze the extent to which argument, it's actually a pretty meaty question because again, you're looking at both industrialization and what happens as a result of it. All right, well, we're going to start at the very beginning with this phrase, the market revolution. Now, you may or may not know that I also teach economics, and talking about market economy is one of the first things we talk about in economics class. And when I teach about market economy in economics class, I pose my students the following question. What do you think of when you hear the word market? And so go ahead, what do you think of when you hear the word market? Pretend this is Daniel Tiger. Answer me. Okay, great. When my students in my economics class are posed this question, generally their answers to this question will be a supermarket, like Ralph's, a farmer's market, and once in a while, a student says the stock market. These are the three most common responses. And all are a really good image of what a market is. Let's go with the farmer's market because I think that is the easiest and most simple form of a market. You have a product to sell. The picture I have here are fruits and vegetables. So you have fruits and vegetables to sell. You put them in baskets. You lay them on a table. And customers come by and using a mode of exchange, for us that's money, they trade you money, you give them fruit and vegetables. That's a market. It's a place where buyers and sellers exchange goods and services. A supermarket is the same idea, except there's a lot more product. And a stock market is actually the same idea, except instead of trading fruits and vegetables for money, you're buying and selling small little bits of corporations. Now, if you don't understand the stock market, we will address that at a later date. And so, like I said, markets are any place where buyers and sellers exchange things. You get to exchange the things you have for what you want and need. Now, in a market economy, we take this idea to a bigger level. And what we do is we allow specialization. So in the old days, the olden times, if you wanted to buy a shirt, you could buy a shirt from a local artisan. Someone in their home would have been an expert shirt maker, and they would have possibly had you know, sheep or some sort of animal that had the product that you need to make shirts out of. Okay, clearly I'm not a farmer or a shirt maker, but I know wool comes from sheep. So let's pretend you're making a wool shirt. So if this were olden times and you were a shirt making artisan, you'd have a small flock of sheep. You'd shear the sheep. You'd do whatever it is that takes that fur and turns it into whatever you need it to do to become wool. And then you take that wool, you weave it into a product, you sew it together, and then you may sell your products on a small scale. Or maybe you trade them for food, depending on, where you live and what time period we're talking about. That's how the economy was functioning. In the industrial era, the first industrial revolution, the market revolution, whatever you want to call this time period, what ends up happening is we move away from America as having artisans, and we move into a more centralized factory-based economy. And so the market revolution sees Americans moving away from producing stuff largely for themselves on independent farms and more towards producing goods to sell to other people who are often very far away. And with the idea of more people producing comes the idea of competition. So competition ends up driving the prices. Specialization allows for the efficient use of resources. And you have this whole other kind of economy. So, if you recall, Jefferson wanted us to be a nation of small farmers. Jefferson liked the picture of the small artisan. Hamilton wanted an industrial economy. Well, here we are. We're at the moment that Hamilton begins to win because we do adopt the beginnings of a market economy. And so if you look at my pictures here, and again, this is a presentation from my econ class, but it definitely applies here, so I just popped it into your presentation. In specialization, instead of you having a small, herd of sheep that you shear and you take the wool and cure it and turn it into material for making shirts and you weave it and you sew it and you sell it out of your house. Specialization in a market economy says one person does the farming, someone else shears those sheep, someone else takes the wool and processes it to where it can be made into clothes. A factory worker takes that and makes it into clothes, and instead of selling it out of your house or your small farm, it goes to a centralized location. In modern times, well, actually, 20 years ago, it would have been a store. That's why I have the block in orange. Although, to be fair, I think we mostly just buy stuff from Amazon now. But, you see the process is very different. Well, we could not have had this change in structure without a change in transportation. The new technology that allowed a transportation revolution is a huge part of us having a market economy. In the 1700s, it was really, really difficult to bring goods to markets because we didn't have the transportation structure that would have allowed that. And that's why most products, were sold on a small scale in local communities. Trading over land would have cost way too much money. So, for example, in the 1700s, if you were going to sell something and try to move it from Cincinnati, Ohio to New York, you would have had to, instead of going across land, Ohio and New York, they're not that far from each other. But there was no direct route. There was no road. There was no train. It was too expensive and too time consuming to transport your product over land from Ohio to New York. So what you would have had to do is send your project all the way down the Mississippi River, through the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, up the Atlantic coast, and then it would have come into a port in New York. Now think about that for a second. That's crazy. Now, even though this side of the country where you and I live, wasn't as, wasn't quote unquote developed, at least in our sense, because we weren't part of America yet. To put this in geographical, maybe sentiment for you, that means if you had a product in, let's say, Las Vegas that you were selling to Garden Grove, instead of sending it across land from Vegas to Garden Grove, you would go all the way down south. Let's use the Rio Grande into the Rio Grande waterway. Somehow you end up in the Gulf of Mexico. You go all the way around Mexico. You go up past Baja California, and then it comes in at a port in San Pedro or something. Anyway, that's kind of a stretch, but I'm just trying to give the geography in a way that makes sense to you because you might not be as familiar with Ohio and New York. If you understand, that is a very, very roundabout way of delivering something, very inefficient. um in fact, if you can believe it, trading goods 30 miles in America was just as expensive as shipping a product to England, right? So our transportation definitely needed to be improved if we wanted to move into a market economy, and it was. We saw a massive expansion in transportation in this time period. Roads were built. My favorite one is the National Road. It was called the Cumberland. It was this like supposed to be this huge project that was, going to connect America. And the original Cumberland Road is like this purple part right here. That was like the Cumberland Road. Right, it shows you how small scale America initially was. But anyway, eventually the road is expanded, and you can see that the road does take us all the way to St. Louis, Missouri, eventually. And so that's a pretty important route. I know it's so hard for you and I to imagine. I do think about this stuff because, I'm weird, but it's just so hard to imagine a world without roads. You and I are used to sidewalks, and like, my gosh, we don't even have potholes in the road. And to imagine a time where traveling 2 miles on a road would have taken 2 days or 3 days is just, it's so impossible for us to imagine, right? I mean, I went running and I ran 6 miles yesterday. Right, it took me less than an hour because there's trails and roads. I don't need to worry about cutting through wild terrain and whatnot. So it's really hard for us to imagine how important this was, but it is important, and it's just so foreign to us, especially out here on the West Coast where everyone has a car. But keep in mind that, I mean, this transformation of economy would have been impossible without these, transformations in transportation. That was a lot of portation words. Anyway, besides roads, you also have canals that are built. Canals were a huge part of shipping, and transporting goods. They were actually more important than roads. Transportation was cheaper and more efficient through canals. Canals were made especially efficient with the invention of the steamboat by Robert Fulton. And canals, again, were, a way of linking different parts of the country using waterways and an ability to ship things. Now, again, you and I live on the West Coast, and we don't really have this as part of our local history, but you can see on the map in the upper right-hand corner there the principal canals of this time period. The most famous canal is the Erie Canal, and the Erie Canal linked the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, and New York is where this is, if you can look on the map, New York is where this is centered. So again, New York was already known as a great shipping location, and the Erie Canal allowed the easier movement. Because again, if you can kind of follow the path, if you ship something on the Erie Canal, now you're to the Great Lakes, you can ship something onto Lake Erie, and you can from there either use the Ohio and Erie Canal to continue. You can use the Wabash Erie Canal. So again, you can see there's kind of these different pathways you can take to ship products. Other trails, the Conestoga Trail allowed for the movement of products through covered wagons. And like I wrote up there for you, by 1832, nearly 2,400 miles of road connected the major cities. So again, huge transportation revolution happening in this era. Of course, the biggest transportation revolution of all, sorry canals, were the railroads. And railroads started off in probably really started off in about the 1820s, and then became more and more and more important as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. And you can see that with the improvements in transportation, with the improvements in transportation, the cost of shipping decreased rapidly, right? So you can see how much shipping cost in the early years. You can see, like, for example, let's look at upstream river rates, right? It was pretty expensive to ship products in 1795 on the rivers. But by 1835, shipping had decreased incredibly. Canals as well. If you look, as the canals are improved and more canals are built, you can see how cheap it is to ship things via canal. So again, when the cost of shipping goes down, that encourages more people to produce more products that they can move and sell, because now it's not costing you too much to ship your product, right? If shipping costs too much, you don't have a motivation to ship your product, right? Because either you're going to have to pay for the shipping cost as the producer, or you're going to have to charge your customer more money to cover the shipping cost, and they're not going to buy it because it's too expensive. So having a decrease in shipping prices is a huge advantage, and a huge catalyst in why the market economy continues to grow in this time period. All right, well, eventually, like I said, by the 1830s, the railroad is really taking off as the preferred mode of transportation for products. Canals are still going to be pretty heavily used, but as the country moves more westward, railroads are going to become increasingly important. Here's a famous depiction of a horse versus a train, and the iron horse, the railroad, is winning here. In 1830, there were 13 miles of track in America. That's it. By 1850, there were 9,000 miles of track. By 1860, there were 31,000 miles of track. So you can see that the railroad industry really explodes in this antebellum time period. And you can see that it's imbalanced. If you look at the initial railroads, those are the ones in the black. The initial railroads by 1850, even those railroads are centered mostly in New England, in the north. And then if you look at the ones built between 1850 and 1860, you can see that most of them are snaking from the northeast out to the west. Okay, if you can look at the top, there's a lot more crisscrossing lines up in the top. I mean, compare that to the south. So again, you're having a sectional division here, as the north is becoming more and more industrial and the south is still clinging to the traditional agricultural economy. Um, Now, the northern and western, I suppose, northwestern railroads are built by immigrant labor. The railroads that are built in the south are built by using slave labor. So, again, the market revolution does pull America into a different kind of economy, but there are positives and negatives. Let's put it that way. And there are some people that are going to become incredibly rich as a result of the market economy, and there's a lot of people who are going to bear the brunt of building the market economy and not really see the rewards, like the people who built the railroads. Another important aspect of this era is the idea of Yankee ingenuity, or the idea that Americans are going to make new inventions, right? That the sky's the limit in America with creativity. And there's a lot of inventions that are made that really transform our economy. The most famous one that you probably learned about in junior high school was the cotton gin. At the end of the 1700s, the cotton market, you could argue that the cotton market and the reliance on slavery was actually starting to decline. Cotton was a really hard product to produce. It took a long time to clean the cotton, right? You can pick all the cotton you want, but if you can't clean it to process it to be usable to make textiles, then you're going to have a bunch of rotten cotton. The cotton gin changes that. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin makes it so the cotton itself, once it's picked, can be cleaned and processed quicker. And so the cotton gin leads to more slavery. Sometimes I see answers that the cotton gin made cotton easier to pick, therefore it led to a decrease in slaves. That is 100% wrong. That means you don't understand what the cotton gin does. The cotton gin cleans cotton, doesn't pick cotton. So if I can clean the cotton faster, that means I can pick more cotton. But I am a southern plantation owner. I don't actually do any of that. So if I want more cotton picked, I am going to buy more slaves to pick more cotton. And that's why the cotton gin is so famous, because it really reinvigorates the cotton industry, and as a result, reinvigorates the slave industry. Eli Whitney is also well known for the concept of interchangeable parts. That means when a product breaks, you make all the products the same with the same parts. That way, they're not unique, and it's easier to fix products and create products. If they all have the same parts, then you can just have almost like an assembly line, and you can put the parts where they go because everything's being made exactly the same. So again, that was a really, really important concept when you're trying to make large scale amounts of products. Other things you might not think about, flour mills to factory produce food products like flour. The mechanical reaper allowed for a more efficient harvest, right? Because the mechanical reaper was going to do jobs that had to be done by hand. The steel plow. Again, another transformation in agricultural products. The sewing machine, not having to sew by hand. My gosh, can you imagine the ramifications of that? Rubber, new products, vulcanized rubber. Well, rubber's not a new product, but mixing rubber with, I believe, sulfur that makes the product not melt in the heat, unleashes this kind of rubber craze where people are making all sorts of stuff out of rubber. The telegraph, new ideas in communication, the idea that you could communicate via wires, right? Kind of like a precursor to the telephone. A lot of just a insane amount of ideas play into what allowed us to really move in the direction of a market economy. And you can see that again, it's this kind of explosion of ideas in this era. In 1800, there were 41 patents. A patent is if you have a really, really good idea and you don't want someone to steal it, you apply for a patent. Okay, so in 1800, there were 41 patents for that 1 year. In 1860, there were over 4,300 patents that were approved for that year. So again, you can see there's an explosion in ideas. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know why the picture of the automated flour mill didn't show up, but, if you wondered what an automated flour mill looked like, now you know. Now, a lot of these products couldn't have been made without a move into a factory system. Now, like I mentioned when I was talking about the basis of a market economy and specialization, the factory system is where specialization is really happening for the first time. You gather all the workers in one place, and then you give them specific tasks to do, all to create one final product. And this was a really huge difference from a country that had been, a nation of Jeffersonian small farmers, to have these big factories. And the first factories are all built by water because the first factories were all water powered. But when the steam engine was invented, you have this idea that factories can spring up other places. And so a lot of factories will spring up in places like the Midwest. One of the most famous factories, in fact, I would say the most famous factory of this era, is the Lowell girls, or the factories of the Lowell mills. And the Lowell mills were factories in Massachusetts. The city is Lowell, Massachusetts. And unmarried young farm women from New England would go work in these factories. Women were working out of the home for the first time. Now, keep in mind, these women didn't have extra rights or anything. These are poor New England women, and they're making money for their family. They're not there on an independent, kind of way. And once they're married, they're no longer going to work. So again, it's kind of like when you're old enough, you're sent to the Lowell mill, to the factory, to work and make textiles. And then when you are, married off, you no longer work, right? Because now you're belonging to your husband. Women were given, the idea is that women, you don't have to pay as much. And that's why the Lowell mill will hire women as opposed to men initially. Like I mentioned, the initial factories were built on water, which is why you see an abundance of factories in the Massachusetts, kind of Rhode Island, Connecticut area. And then as the century moves on and steam power is invented, you can see the shift of the factories moving out to the Midwest. But really, New England dominated in the textile factory industry. The South, not as much. They still really were dependent on being agricultural and having the big plantations. So you do again see sectionalism here, as New England and the Northeast are really embracing an industrial economy, and the South not so much. I already mentioned the Lowell girls, but there are some images of the girls working. You can see that they're quite young if you look at the picture at the top. I realize it's hard to tell ages with the bottom picture, because if you've been poor and then you work in a factory at a young age, you're going to be, your face is going to age more rapidly than it was if you were sitting in a classroom, not having to do hard labor. I've also given you here a kind of table, a schedule It says timetable of the Lowell mills. This is kind of like a daily schedule. Um, you could see that they averaged an 11-hour workday. It kind of tells when the bell's going to ring. So the first bell for work rings at 4:30, and think about that for a second. Especially those of you who complain about being at zero period at 7. Your bell rings at 7. Their bell rings at 4:30. Just a thought. So again, it shows you in the 1800s, they didn't use the word lunch. They used the word dinner for lunch. I know, weird, right? So dinner bell is like their lunch bell. Anyway, so you can kind of look at this if you want. You can pause it and look at it in more detail. It's just kind of like the kind of day of a Lowell girl. I've also included a poem or a chant or a song, if you will, written by a Lowell girl. The Lowell girls actually, interestingly enough, attempted to unionize, which is so funny because we don't really think about labor unions until much later, and we don't really often think of labor unions as being started by women. But there was a move. It was unsuccessful, but there was a move by these Lowell girls to try and come together to get more rights and sign petitions because of the very difficult labor they were expected to do each day for such low pay. So here's their chant. I'm a factory girl, every day filled with fear from breathing in the poison air, wishing for windows. I'm a factory girl, tired from the 13 hours of work each day, and we have such low pay, wishing for shortened work times. I'm a factory girl, never having enough time to eat nor to rest my feet, wishing for more free time. I'm a factory girl, sick of all this harsh conditions, making me want to sign the petition. So do what I ask because I'm a factory girl and I'm hereby speaking for all the rest. So again, there was an interesting move to try and get rights. It's again unsuccessful. Union labor is something we'll talk more about at the end of the 1800s. But it does give you the perspective that whereas the market economy definitely has positives, making it cheaper to ship products and making us have more economic power as a country, that economic power and that prestige is built on the backbones of people like the Lowell girls who are working 11 to 13-hour days in, pretty treacherous conditions in factories that have no windows. And, it's a really hard life. Well, eventually, the Lowell girls will be replaced, and the Lowell girls will be replaced by Irish immigrants. As everyone seems to remember, this is one of those random facts that I feel like every person in America seems to know. There was a potato famine in Ireland in the 1800s, and as a result of the potato famine, Irish former potato farmers moved in large numbers to America. Some of them were potato farmers, and some of them were just unskilled Irish workers who had no food. And they moved again in huge numbers to America. Now, there were at the same time immigrants coming from Germany, and the immigrants coming from Germany were coming for political reasons. So you have two different push factors. In Ireland, it's starvation. In Germany, it's political unrest. You also have different groups of people coming. The Germans who came over were mostly educated and had a certain level of skill. And most of them would work as farmers and moved to like present day Wisconsin, if you can see where I circled it for you on the map. The Irish who came over were largely uneducated, unskilled, and therefore went directly into factory work. And so you can see where it says industrial workers on the map. That's where the Irish immigrants went. So again, the factory work, by the time the Civil War comes about, is being done heavily by Irish immigrants. Now, there is a phrase you may have heard called laissez-faire, and this is a French word that really means leave it alone, let it be. When we use the word laissez-faire in American history, we use it to describe the economy. We use it to describe an economy where the government has no say, right? That the government doesn't play a role. And this is generally how you hear a market economy explained. A market economy is explained as a laissez-faire economy, or an economy where, again, the government doesn't really play a role. So, for example, in a farmer's market, if I were to start a farmer's market outside my house right now, and I sold the, like, 4 blackberries that grow in my backyard, I would set a price for those blackberries based on what I think the other people in my neighborhood would be willing to pay for them. I don't need the government to come in and tell me how much to charge, because the wants and needs of the people in my neighborhood are going to dictate that. And if my neighbor, who has a much better garden than I do, decides to put out their food, that's going to also help drive the prices, because now there's competition, right? And so we call this laissez-faire. And in a pure market economy, it's often described that a pure market economy is totally laissez-faire and doesn't involve the government. And because America is a market economy, there is this kind of American myth that the government doesn't play a role in our economy, and that it never did. And this is just incorrect. Honestly, we never would have been able to build the market economy we have without the involvement of the government. The government actually helps create a business-friendly country. So, for example, the Supreme Court makes a number of rulings that benefit business. For example, both Fletcher versus Peck and Dartmouth versus Woodward have to do with the federal government protecting private contract rights. Fletcher versus Peck had to do with land that had been illegally sold, that the person who sold it wasn't really theirs to sell. And when this is discovered, the people of the state want the land to be basically taken back from the people who bought it. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's not the buyer's fault that they bought something that, even though the initial seizure of the land by the person who sold it was illegal, you can't penalize the person who bought it. It's not their responsibility to look into, the legal way that this land was taken. And it says that the states cannot invalidate a contract. And so that's the contract being the purchase of the land. And so that can be applied to business. It really protects contract rights. Dartmouth versus Woodward is about Dartmouth College. And again, Dartmouth College, the state was trying to force Dartmouth College to become a public institution and rescind its private contract. And the Supreme Court said they could not do that. Gibbons versus Ogden and Charles Rivers Bridge versus Warren also ties in to business protection. Charles River Bridge has to do with monopolies over bridges, for trading. And the Charles River Bridge case said that building a second bridge over the Charles River didn't infringe upon the charter of the first bridge. Gibbons versus Ogden had to do with whether New York had given a monopoly to one steamboat company, and the Supreme Court said they did. They knocked that monopoly down. So again, both the Charles River Bridge case and Gibbons versus Ogden are encouraging business competition, which is a major part of a market economy. And then a little more general, it's not just the judicial branch that helps create a business-friendly climate, but it's all the branches of government, including the state governments. State and corporation laws make it easy for corporations or businesses to form. The federal government had a huge hand in funding different transportation means, including canals and roads. States issued bonds to build canals. Railroads were given deals by state governments to encourage, railroads to be built in their territory. They were given, free land or land grants. And, there were ways that the states and the federal government really encouraged this market economy. So it's incorrect to buy into the American myth that government and economy are totally separate, that we have a laissez-faire, hands-off, economy, because that's really never been the case. People argue today over how much involvement the government should have in economy, and I think it's a fair argument. How much say should they have in business regulation and whatnot? But to base an argument on the idea that America has always been laissez-faire is just inherently wrong. So now we're going to move over into the second part of this presentation, which is what were the results? Now that we know how America transformed into a market economy, what were the results of this change? Well, one major result is a shift in the distribution of wealth. Now, there was always a gap between rich and poor in America. During the American Revolution, 45% of the wealth was in the top 10% of the population. But the gap between rich and poor grew as a result of our shift into a market economy. Like I've given you here, in 1845, the top 4% in Boston owned 65% of the wealth. In Philadelphia, by the time the Civil War broke out, the top 1% owned over half of the wealth. And this is a major result of a government that was pro-business leaning. For the first time, corporations came about, and the ownership of many businesses was, one big corporation. Market economy also led to an economic system where rich people were able to become more rich by investing their money into these corporations. And so you do have this widening gap between rich and poor. And that widening gap is going to continue to grow. Now, the 1800s is definitely, there's so much that happens, but smack dab in the middle of it, we have a civil war. And so this idea about the struggles between, a market economy and the growing gap between rich and poor, we're going to return to it after the Civil War. So even though when we finish talking about these topics, we're going to move into the Civil War, it doesn't mean these topics and these conflicts went away, because we're going to have to deal with things like the fact that 1% of the population has most of the wealth. Population centers will change as well. So if you can kind of look at the population of America in 1820, so at the start of this kind of era, this market shift into a market economy, you can see that we had a pretty big city in New York. Philadelphia and Baltimore are also fairly large, not quite 100,000 people. In the South, the only real big city you had was New Orleans. So there's just a smattering of, major cities and where the population was concentrated. You can see that by 1860, the cities are much bigger, but you can see that one thing that hasn't changed is the major population centers in the South are still New Orleans, Montgomery, and Charleston, whereas in the North and the Northeast and the West, you can see an explosion of population. New York is now super huge, and so's Brooklyn, and Philadelphia now has over 500,000 people, and all the cities that were sizable in 1820 are now extraordinarily large, and you can see a bunch of other large cities have popped up, and a lot of these explosions in population has a lot to do, of course, with the market revolution, railroads moving westward, being able to trade over land. As railroads were built and as canals were built and as roads were built, you have cities that are built up around these areas of transportation. And you also have a shift in occupation. In 1820, at the start of the market revolution, according to the census, 78% of the American population, their occupation was agriculture. We were farmers. Okay, 78%. By the time the Civil War comes around, that number has dropped to 52%. So only a little over half of Americans still considered themselves farmers. And you can see the shift, okay? A lot more Americans count themselves as being involved in manufacturing or construction or trade, right? These are the areas that grew in this time period. Another result of the market revolution was increased regional specialization. Now, this in turn leads to increased sectionalism. As the South becomes more heavily invested in cotton and slavery, it becomes not industrialized to the point that the Northeast, and even the West become. Now, the West served as the nation's breadbasket, meaning that the crops the West was growing were things like wheat. However, there was a big connection between the Northeast and the West, and railroad routes were built between, again, the Northeast and the West. The Northeast provided the West with industrial goods, and the West provided the Northeast with food. And increasingly, as we get closer to the Civil War, the South is left out of that equation. But not entirely. Because remember that the North, one of the big industrial products that was being made were textiles or fabrics. That's what was being made at the Lowell mills, for example. Well, you can't have the textiles without the cotton needed to make the clothes. So you can see that indirectly, the North was being supplied by slave labor. So it becomes a very complicated topic when you talk about whether or not the South should continue to have slaves. And so the market revolution leaves us with a lot of kind of uneasy questions about what it means to be American and what is the American dream and even what is freedom. To some, the market revolution was proof of achieving this American dream. The material advancement of our country was the proof that American republicanism was successful. So the market revolution seemed to confirm that America was correct in the way it was being run, and the American dream was the growing amount of money that our country had. Others viewed the material advancements of the era with fear, as it seemed to undermine American values. For example, Jefferson had warned against the idea of factories, because to Jefferson, the idea of being a wage laborer, meaning that you're paid by the hour, was a dangerous concept. Because if you are in a factory all day being paid a certain amount of money, regardless of how much product you create, where's the freedom in that? Right? So again, this material advancement did lead to a lot of uneasy feelings among a lot of Americans. And it shows kind of different questions about what is the American dream then? Is the American dream a strong market society with products and technology and greater ease that comes with these products and technology? Is the American dream not about technological advancement, but is it about self-reliance and self-improvement that is a universal truth outside of societal norms? Is the American dream about salvation? Is it about salvation that is unachievable, is in opposition with the selfishness and materialism of a market society? Or is the American dream equality? And if so, equality for whom? Because we know that Native Americans have no voice. We know that Black Americans, even freed Black Americans, have very little voice, and most Black Americans are enslaved. We know that women do not have a voice politically. And we know that most of the economic wealth that is being generated in this era is done by very, very poor Americans who really are not seeing the fruits of their labor. So if the American dream's equality, how is the market revolution achieving that? And so, though there were people who were certainly pleased and happy with the direction of industrialization, there were people unhappy about it. To some people, the market society created selfishness and a fast-paced society that was hard to keep up with. Material consumerism was becoming the norm. People were seeming to buy into the idea of consumption. And there was a sense that the market society took emphasis away from family life and placed it on material success. And so you have people viewing this time period as wrought with problems and problems that needed to be fixed. And so we call this reaction the antebellum reform movement. Antebellum refers to before the Civil War, ante before, bellum war. Reform are anybody who wants to change something, right? If you want to change something about Garden Grove High School, you are wanting to reform it. And a movement just refers to a large group of people participating. So, before the Civil War, trying to change America for the better, movements. And one of the motivations of the antebellum reform movement was this belief in perfectionism, which was the idea that individuals in society were capable of unlimited improvement. So there's definitely a belief in this time that people had the power to improve society. Now, improving society is going to manifest itself in a number of different ways. You could argue that the most famous movement of the era was the Second Great Awakening. Now, if you recall, the First Great Awakening was a rebirth of interest in religion. The Second Great Awakening is the same thing, but like times 1,000, times 1,000,000, right? It is a really, really, really huge movement trying to bring people back to Protestant Christianity. And out of the Second Great Awakening comes a lot of other reform movements. So the Second Great Awakening was partly influenced by the unease people felt as we moved into a market economy. The Second Great Awakening itself was the springboard to a number of other reform movements besides trying to get people back into a religious fervor. Now, the Second Great Awakening is different than the first. The Second Great Awakening involves a plethora of Protestant religious denominations. Now, I'm going to highlight some of the more unique ones, but keep in mind that what we'll call mainstream for the purposes of this presentation, there were a number of mainstream denominations who were involved. Congregationalists, Methodists were very big in the Second Great Awakening. Baptists were very big in the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, what all of these denominations had in common is they stressed the individual choice for salvation and a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That's kind of like the main focus. Many of these pastors and speakers were criticizing the selfishness of the market economy. That was one angle. But there's also this movement towards trying to perfect society, right? What problems were there in society that need to be, addressed? Alcoholism, for example, was a problem that needed to be addressed. Slavery was a problem that needed to be addressed. Conditions for people who were being held in prison was a problem that needed to be addressed. So you can see a lot of reform movements came out of the Second Great Awakening. So when we look at the Second Great Awakening, we look at what are often called camp or tent meetings. And they were these big, almost like picture like festivals where people would go and listen to various speakers from all different religious denominations, and they would appeal a lot of times on an emotional level to get people reawakened to the need for salvation. And I've given you some pictures here. Charles G. Finney is probably the most famous preacher from the Second Great Awakening. And the description, the ranges of the tents, the fires, reflecting lights, the candles and lamps illuminating the encampment, hundreds moving to and fro, the preaching, praying, singing, and shouting, like the sound of many waters, was enough to swallow up all the powers of contemplation. So these were huge, massive religious movements. And the area that was, I guess, the hotbed for these movements was upstate New York. So I've shown you on the map, kind of the part of New York around the Great Lakes region was kind of the center point for these different religious revivals and tent meetings. Now, that they happened all throughout the country, but New York was kind of like the hotbed for it. And it was, there were so many, you can see, there were so many from this map. There were so many revivals and camp meetings and religious fervor happening in New York that New York was called the burnt over district. And it's kind of the imagery that the preachers were lighting, awakening people with like fire, right? They're on, the people are on fire. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression. Sometimes when someone is very excited about their religious beliefs, they're described as on fire. So they're on fire for, and then you fill in a religious figure, okay? They're on fire for Jesus. They're on fire for Buddha. They're on fire, so on and so forth. All right. So again, because this area was had so many people, quote unquote, on fire, it is nicknamed the Burnt Over District because there were so many different religious revivals happening in this region. Now, I told you we would not talk about what we're going to call here the mainstream beliefs. So, Charles Finney, for example, was a mainstream preacher, right? And so there were a number of preachers that were from, again, what we're going to call the mainstream Protestant denominations. And so we're not going to talk too much about those, but we are going to talk about some of these other religious movements that were at the time new and got some backlash. For example, the Mormon Church, now known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was founded in this time period and in this burnt over region. And Mormon belief said that Joseph Smith was the recipient of a revelation that is almost like an additional part of the Bible, which the LDS Church holds as Holy Scripture. And it talks about the resurrected Jesus' visit to the Americas. They actually the Mormon Church faced widespread persecution. They were removed from New York and the East Coast, similar to the Native American removals. They were removed and pushed westward. And they eventually ended up in present-day Salt Lake City, Utah. Another group that, again, at the time would have been not mainstream were the Shakers. And the Shakers were a religious movement that also crosses into the idea of utopia. Again, each of these groups thought that they were making their own perfect society. Shaker communities wanted to be totally separate from the competition of a market economy. And Shakers believed that they were in touch with religious revelation and I guess maybe the phrase were in touch with the Holy Spirit when they were doing these dance moves, thus called Shakers. Anyway, you can see it's not twerking or anything. Look at the picture. Okay, so that's them in their Shaker communities. Shakers were celibate, which means that they did not engage in sexual relations. They did, however, embrace the equality of the sexes, and they were a fairly successful utopian community for the time. So they're religious, but it also crosses over into being a utopia community because they set themselves apart from the rest of society and were living in a non-competitive frame of mind, right? They didn't even compete for spouses because, again, they're celibate. They don't believe in sexual relations. And they were led by Mother Ann Lee. And here are some quotes from her. She says, "If you take up your crosses against the works of generations and follow Christ in the regeneration, God will cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Remember the cries of those who are in need and trouble, that when you are in trouble, God may hear your cry. And if you improve in one talent, God will give you more." Okay, so again, definitely an idea of self-improvement here, but it's an idea that is a religiously based self-improvement. The Shakers believed in simple living, and they actually wrote a number of hymns or religious songs. I had no idea that this was a Shaker hymn until years later. We used to sing this in elementary school choir. I don't know what you sang in elementary school choir, but this was one of the songs we sang, and I really liked the song. I had no idea what it meant, but anyway, now I know as an adult it was a Shaker hymn, right? So, 'tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. right? Simple, separate yourselves from a market economy. Freedom, equality, that was, again, a big part of a lot of these reform movements. When true simplicity is gained, you won't bend, you won't bow. True simplicity is how you want to live your life. And then there's a reference to the dancing. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, turning we come round right. So kind of gives you maybe a little sense of Shaker life. If not, that was a nice flashback to elementary school choir. And slightly ironically, the Shakers will die out. I mean, I guess technically you may be able to Google the Shaker communities. I'm sure there's still some today, but they were not successful. I mean, partly because they don't have future generations. If you're celibate, you don't generally have kids. Anyway, so with that, so they were not super successful in the sense of being a long-term community, but they were really good at making furniture. And even today, you can still buy Shaker furniture, which is so ironic because they had separated themselves from the market economy, and now the only thing they're known for is for their furniture, which is sold in the market economy. Well, one of the most, I think, complicated movements for high school students to understand is transcendentalism. So I'm going to do my best to try and explain this to you in a way that isn't too philosophical and out there. Basically, transcendentalism is another response to the market economy. Our most famous transcendentalists were writers. You may have heard of Henry David Thoreau, and maybe you've heard of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Both of those men would be transcendentalists. And both of these men wrote that people should focus on self-improvement and self-reliance rather than doing what society deems to be correct. Basically, they wanted people to step back from the market economy and focus on their own goals and doing what they wanted to do. Emerson was quoted as writing about the fact that personal growth is limited by the pursuit of wealth. And of course, the pursuit of wealth is the goal of a market economy. So again, this is definitely another response to the market economy. There is a philosophical part in this. Transcendentalism believed that there was a kind of a pure version of, for lack of better word, the soul. And if you could transcend the limitations of intellect and allow your emotions, your soul, to engage, you would be able to return to that original relationship with the universe. And in order to do that, man had to acknowledge certain moral truths that you knew inside your heart, right? These are truths that you didn't have to learn through intellect. You naturally knew them. One was the infinite or unending benevolence of God, the unending benevolence of nature, and the divinity of man. Now, this sounds very religious, but Transcendentalism was actually not a religious movement. Transcendentalism rejected all government or secular authority, non-religious authority, and they also rejected the authority of organized churches, the scriptures, laws, traditional rites that went along with, Judeo-Christian tradition. Because they felt that all of that clouded what was intuitively inside us as human beings. Now, if that was all way too philosophical and you're like you're fast forwarding because it's like so over your head, don't worry about it. Here's the takeaway. If you believed in the ideas of transcendentalism, you would also believe that it was wicked for a man to be held in slavery. And so the role of a reformer was to get man to the part to the place, where they could be restored in how they were originally created. It's very similar to deism, if you learned that in world history. Maybe a little more hippie than deism, but it's that kind of image of a creator god. Anyway, takeaway from this: transcendentalism believed in equality. So you'll find a lot of transcendentalists who were anti-slavery and for women's rights. Okay, so the transcendentalist agenda then: free the slaves, help the poor. Educational reform was a reform focus of transcendentalists. They wanted to give learning to the ignorant, help the sick, right? Peace and justice to society. Because to transcendentalists, these were all natural rights. So transcendentalists wanted to restore natural rights to all of mankind, men and women, black and white, social classes. Although, to be fair, transcendentalists were always from the upper class. Now, like I said, our most famous transcendentalists are Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau will be an inspiration. His idea of civil disobedience, or passively resisting laws that were unjust, was very inspirational to both Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Both 20th century figures will cite Henry David Thoreau as a major influence to the way they enacted their campaigns. Now you can see that the push for perfection takes on a number of different ways. Some people try to perfect society by following traditional or mainstream, maybe is a better word, Protestant Christian teachings through the Methodist churches, through the Baptist churches. Some try to reach perfection by following some of these newer religious movements, the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Shakers, and some embraced transcendentalism. And there were certain groups, like we already talked about, the Shakers, that separated themselves from society to make their own mini perfect society. Okay, so there is some overlap. For example, on this map, the Shakers are referred to as a religious community. You will see other maps where the Shakers are referred to as a utopia. So it just kind of depends. There's definitely some overlapping here. But if you look, you can see that there's a number of religious and utopian communities. A lot of the utopian communities were transcendentalists and not religious. For example, the Oneida community was a community that believed everyone was one big family, and as a result, they lived communally. There was no private property, and there was no one-on-one marriage. Okay, so you didn't have one partner you belonged to. They believed in something they called free love. And they were influenced by the belief that the second coming of Christ had already occurred, and therefore it was possible to achieve perfection on earth because you were no longer waiting for the second coming of Christ to restore the world. In the minds of the Oneida community, it had already happened. So they separated themselves to achieve what they thought was sinless perfection. And they feel like they don't have to follow the moral rules of the past because, again, in their mind, perfection has already occurred. And so, again, they believed in the idea of free love. They believed in the idea of shared property, communalism. They believed in mutual criticism, which was the idea that if people were not reaching perfection or were committing acts that the community determined was sinful, that their, family, quote unquote, members, because everyone, remember, is one big family, that their family members would call them out in a session called mutual criticism. They also believed in the idea of eugenics, which was choosing people to breed to make super children. If you had a child, it was not yours. So all children were raised together. You didn't get any special treatment from whoever was your biological parent. There's some other stuff in here about mentor women helping younger boys, not younger, excuse me, helping maybe boys who are like 19 and 20, which is still really young, learn certain things, and I think I'll leave it there. So anyway, Google the Oneida community. You can read more about free love and eugenics, and it always kind of makes me think of The Giver. Did you ever read the book The Giver, right? Like they had a community where, it was communal and everyone shared everything and you didn't know who your biological parents really were, and kind of like that with some other spicy stuff mixed in that I'm not going to talk about. Now, the Oneida community, also interestingly enough, was not a successful, long-standing utopia. None of these utopias is successful in the long run. But much like the Shakers, the Oneida community turned out they made really, really good silverware. And so even today, when people are eating from their forks and knives and spoons in America, a lot of people own Oneida silverware. I have some. I know, because when I got married, I registered for it and received it. So again, it's kind of ironic that these communities that were originally founded as a means of separating themselves from the market economy, today the only things we know about their names are associated with products that are sold in a market economy. Now, when you look at the antebellum reform movements, it's easy to just categorize them all as wanting to achieve equality and wanting to achieve freedom. And that's actually not really accurate, because when you look at something like the temperance movement, although the people involved, like Francis Willard, Lyman Beecher and his family, although there was certainly a movement to outlaw alcohol to try and fix a lot of social problems that went along with alcoholism, you have to ask yourself, is outlawing alcohol truly giving people freedom? And what you have to remember is that for 19th century reformers, freedom wasn't about being able to do whatever you wanted to do. The word they used for doing whatever you wanted to do was called license. They wouldn't have used freedom for me getting to do whatever I want to do right now. To them, freedom was an internal phenomena that came from self-discipline and self-control. So instead of being free to drink alcohol, you wanted to be free from the temptation to drink alcohol, right? So it's not enough to avoid sin. You needed to perfect your community so people wouldn't even want to sin, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing when you look at reform movements, because we are taught from the time that we learn about America that America is the land of freedom. It's easy to think that reform movements are all about you getting to do what you want to do to make America a better place. And that's just not accurate. That's a very modern way of looking at freedom. To these people, perfectionism wasn't about making a society where everyone got to do what they wanted. In fact, that wouldn't be perfection at all. That would be a society where people could do whatever they wanted would be very dangerous. And so, again, perfection to these people was being able to make a sinless society. Even non-religious reformers believed that there was the ability to perfect society through individual self-control and self-study. And so the temperance movement sought to ban alcohol. That was the point of the temperance movement. And it had a lot of support. I mean, the alcohol consumption in this time period is double what it is today. I mean, there was a huge amount of drinking. And, there was a lot of, according to especially women, there was a lot of abuse at the hands of their husbands and, spouses. And so there was a belief that a lot of society's moral problems stemmed from alcoholism. Well, a lot of these topics don't go away when the Civil War starts, and they also aren't realized either. So the temperance movement had gained some ground. The state of Maine, for example, will pass state laws limiting the consumption of alcohol, but on a national level, the temperance movement didn't make any huge ground in this era. However, in the years moving forward after the Civil War, the temperance movement will continue to grow. So again, a lot of these antebellum reform movements we will return to as we progress through American history. Another movement is for educational reform. So let's review. The temperance movement was trying to deal with a moral problem that a lot of people thought was, the root of a lot of evils in our society. So you can see how that might have come out of the Second Great Awakening, which was trying to create a society that was more perfect and less sin. Educational reform is also going to grow out of the Second Great Awakening with the idea of equality and the idea that all Americans should have access to a free and public education. Massachusetts was the first state to establish tax support for public schools. By 1860, every state offered free public education to whites, so we're not quite to the equality part yet. Horace Mann was dubbed the father of American education. He thought that by teaching children young, they could be molded into a state of perfection, right? How do you have a society achieve perfectionism? Well, mold the children into a state of perfection when they're young. It was Horace Mann that argued that teachers should go through state training programs, that there should be some sort of standard, right, for who was going to teach you. He discouraged corporal punishment. He discouraged whipping students or beating students. There were new readers that were created. The McGuffey readers were very famous. They used religious values to teach what were called American values. And, a lot of the lessons focused on morality and respect and really talked about the Protestant work ethics. So while you're learning words like hog, log, joy, these words in the picture up there, when you get to the story part, you are learning values based on the Protestant work ethic, the importance of hard work, the importance of staying sober, the importance of not wasting. These are the lessons you would be learning along with learning how to read. There was also a push for women's education. Female seminaries had been opened, Mount Holyoke and some other pushes for women to get an education. The Ladies' Book was a magazine. The quote here says, "The Ladies' Book was the first avowed advocate of the holy cause of women's intellectual progress. It has been the pioneer in the wonderful change of the public sentiment respecting female education and the employment of female talent in educating the young. We intend to go on till female education shall receive the same careful attention and liberal support from public legislation as are bestowed on that of the other sex. Such is the mission of the Ladies' Book." So again, there's a big push for women to get an education. And a lot of this had to do with the equality that was being emphasized in the Second Great Awakening. Second Great Awakening said every person had the right to salvation, regardless of gender. And so if Jesus Christ is, because remember, it was a Protestant movement, so if Jesus Christ is willing to die for anybody's sin, regardless of gender, then shouldn't men and women be treated more equally, was kind of the idea. So you can see again how this education for women is directly tied into the Second Great Awakening. And speaking of women, what was the role of women? Now remember, women were expected to be the conscience keepers of America. We called this Republican motherhood. But then, although women had made gains with the idea of Republican motherhood, with advanced education to be able to teach their little sons to be good American citizens, there was the move of us into a market economy. And with a market economy came factory work. And so there became this unease that what if women started moving into the factories? And in fact, poorer women, like the Lowell girls, did move into the factories. And so there's this argument posited that a woman's place must be in the home. And it's called the cult of domesticity. It's the idea, again, that a woman's sphere is in the home, that men and women have inherently separate spheres. Man's sphere is to work outside the home. Women's sphere is to be in the home, civilizing her husband and her family. And with this dual belief in Republican motherhood and separate spheres, life for the early 19th century woman was very limited. She's unable to vote. Her legal status is basically that of a minor. If she's single, she can own property, but if she's married, she no longer has control over her property or even her children. Women who worked in factories like the Lowell girls were young, unmarried women. A married woman would not have been able to work, and even if she had worked, she wouldn't have been able to control her own wages because her wages would have belonged to her husband. She was not allowed to initiate a divorce. She couldn't make wills. She couldn't sign a contract. She couldn't sue someone in court without her husband's permission. So life for early 19th century women was very limited in their voice outside of the sphere at home. And so there's certainly a movement to change that. And like I said, women were inspired by their elevated role due to the Second Great Awakening. Not only did the Second Great Awakening emphasize equality, but women were overrepresented in the Second Great Awakening. Women desired an education and they desired a right to vote. Now, the most visual manifestation of this is the 1948 Seneca Falls Convention. Now, I don't want to go back to a previous slide, but if you remember the slide with the burnt over district where all the religious fervor was happening in upstate New York, Seneca Falls is in upstate New York. So you can see that a lot of the really big notable events that were happening in the antebellum reform movement period were happening in similar locations. So the same women who were participating in the burnt over district and got really inspired by the Second Great Awakening would in turn help facilitate the Seneca Falls Convention. At the Seneca Falls Convention, the women wrote a Declaration of Sentiments, which I've excerpted here for you. They say in this Declaration of Sentiments, now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, or to put it another way, in the view of this entire not being allowed to vote for women, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws mentioned above, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of their most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. The reality is women were not treated as citizens. They weren't. They were treated as minors controlled by their husbands. And so the Declaration of Sentiments was constructed just like the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Sentiments starts out talking about natural rights, goes into the wrongs that men have done against women in society, and end with the section that I have read to you here. Now, I do think it's important to note that these reform movements were not just a white upper class phenomena. I will admit that the women's movement was primarily middle and upper class. Most of the delegates at Seneca Falls were from the middle class. There weren't any representatives from, the cotton mills. But that doesn't mean there weren't 19th century feminists who recognized the needs of working class women. There were also black reformers. There were black educational reformers, and there were black women's rights reformers. Sojourner Truth is a very famous woman. You may have seen in junior high school famous pictures with quotes that say, "Ain't I a woman?" And that's a quote said by Sojourner Truth in this speech that she gave in 1851. So she says, "Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the blacks of the South and the women of the North all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon." What she's saying is, there are so many people talking about people needing rights. There's blacks of the South and women of the North. Between these two groups all talking about rights, the white men of this country are going to be pretty upset soon. And then she goes on to say, "But what's all this here talking about?" And then she starts calling out people. She says, "That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere." So that was a man talking about separate spheres. "Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cried out to my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then that little man in black over there, he says women can't have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them." So again, there is a movement for women to get rights. And Sojourner Truth is a former slave who was also an advocate for women's rights, which I think serves as a lovely transition to the abolitionist movement. Now, if you don't know the word abolition is just the act of abolishing. If you don't know the word abolishing is just getting rid of something. So the abolition movement is getting rid of slavery. And once again, this in part rises out of the Second Great Awakening, because the Second Great Awakening had said that all people are equal in the eyes of God, that all people are able to get salvation. And there's a big movement in the black communities, even in the slave communities. It's not like the Second Great Awakening was this, quiet little movement nobody knew about. Everybody knew about the Second Great Awakening. And black communities, as well as white communities, were influenced by these tent camp meetings and these revivals. And you have black churches organized. The most famous is the AME Church, or the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was a denomination founded in 1816 by an ex-slave and black preacher. So again, the Second Great Awakening was very inspirational to blacks and whites, for lack of a better word, equally, as they try to end, for moral reasons, slavery. Here's a political cartoon with the Friends of Humanity laying the axe to the tree of slavery, which is ever loaded with the sum of all villainies. So the tree of slavery has all these other sinful acts, and the idea is slavery was the most sinful of all the sins. So if they can get that down, maybe it will bring down these other sins with it. Like I said, there were both white abolitionists and black abolitionists. Arguably, the most famous white abolitionist is a man named William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is quoted as saying, "I am in earnest, I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." He was an advocate for immediate emancipation, or ending slavery like right now, at this second, there's nothing to wait for. To him, slavery undermined the Republican values of this country. He argued that slavery was a moral issue, not an economic issue, that there is no justification for slavery on an economic level. It doesn't matter, it's morally wrong. He helped found the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he published a newspaper called The Liberator, which talked all about abolition issues and causes. The Liberty Party and James Birney was another manifestation of the abolition movement by white Americans. It was a third party that ran presidential candidates. Its platform was ending slavery because the issue was being ignored by major parties. And the Liberty Party picks up in the 1840s. So in the 1840s, because of Manifest Destiny, which is a different presentation, slavery is thrust to the forefront of American politics. And so you would have expected the two major parties of the era, the Whigs and the Democrats, to have talked about slavery, but they don't. Both parties ignore the issue. And so the Liberty Party is created for those people who wanted to end slavery and discuss the problem of slavery. The Grimke sisters are, I would say, the other most famous white abolitionists. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were women's rights advocates, but they were also advocates for ending slavery. And Sarah Grimke, I think, puts it the best. She says, "I know nothing of man's rights or woman's rights. Human rights are all that I recognize." And so the Grimke sisters, very interesting, were actually born into a slave-holding family in the South, converted to Quakerism, and fought the rest of their lives against the horrors and the moral bankruptcy of slavery. So they were both women's rights advocates and abolitionists. And you see a lot of crossover. A lot of the women's rights advocates were abolitionists and vice versa. Because women saw a similarity between their absent role in society and the absent role in society of their black brothers and sisters. There were also a number of very famous black abolitionists. David Walker, for example, was a freed black who's most famous for his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, which he wrote with the purpose of encouraging readers to take an active role in fighting their oppression and to press white Americans to realize both the moral and religious failure of slavery, right? Fight for freedom. Don't wait to be set free by whites. He also fought against racism. One of the first, I guess, mentions of dealing with slavery was this idea of the American Colonization Society. And the idea of the American Colonization Society was to deal with freed blacks by deporting them to Africa. This is how the country of Liberia was founded. Liberia, Africa, was created to send American freed blacks to Africa. And he talked about how, inherently racist that was. How if you were in America since the 1600s, your family goes back that far, why in the world would you want to go to some random country in Africa? You don't really have a connection there. So, again, he talked about that. He was very religious, and he particularly found a parallel in the struggles of the ancient Israelites trying to free themselves from the Egyptians, right? And you see that kind of imagery of Moses freeing his people from the Egyptians in a lot of Black abolitionist material in this time period. And you can kind of see from the, I included a picture from his appeal to the colored citizens of the world. You can kind of see the religious allusion in that picture. Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous of the Black abolitionists. Frederick Douglass was a former slave who escaped from slavery to become a very outspoken champion of both abolition and women's rights. He's probably most famous for his autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It's a short read. It's excellent. I highly encourage you to read it at some point in your life. He also published a paper he called The North Star, and he was really big on the speaking circuit. He gave a lot of speeches. One of his most famous speeches is his 4th of July speech, and I've included a quote here for you. He says in his speech, "The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me." Stripes is a reference to the mark you get when you're whipped as a slave. "This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn." So a very powerful speech that he gives on the 4th of July, talking about what it is to, quote unquote, be expected to celebrate a day when you are such a second-class citizen based on the color of your skin. How can you celebrate the 4th of July, right? You don't have the same freedoms as people with lighter skin. Harriet Tubman is also another well-known abolitionist. Harriet Tubman was the conductor of the Underground Railroad, and she helped over 300 slaves escape to freedom. And she was also a Union spy during the Civil War. Finally, we end with a topic that you might not instinctively associate with reform, because when we think reform, it's generally clearly positive and not controversial. Well, I guess everything in this presentation, when we talk about reform, has been a little bit controversial. Utopias, advocating free love or advocating the opposite, celibacy, or different religious groups, whether slavery is morally right or wrong, although it's 2017, slavery is morally wrong, kids. But temperance, you can see how all these movements were quite controversial. Nativism is another movement of the Reform era that was sparked not by the Second Great Awakening, but definitely sparked by the market revolution. So again, another reform movement was immigration reform. And this was particularly targeting the Irish immigrants. I've given you some pictures here of how Irish were viewed. So Irish were always drawn in a particular way. The best way I can describe is they look kind of like monsters. Irish people were always depicted kind of like monsters. They were seen as very violent. It says the usual Irish way of doing things, and he's sitting on a barrel of gunpowder. Irish were depicted as alcoholics. That's why they're often seen carrying booze. Irish weren't considered white. This is supposed to be a scientific drawing where it shows an Anglo-Saxon person. So someone who's English by blood, not Irish. And then there's a person who's Irish over here on the left, and there's a person whose ancestors are from Africa, or a Black American, over here on the right. And what this scientific quote unquote is trying to argue is that Irish are more similar to Black Americans than they are to Anglo-Saxons. Down here, unfortunately, I had to cut off the names. This is Miss Nightingale, and you can see Miss Nightingale is pure and looks very demure. And then this is Mrs. McBruiser. So again, contrasting an Irish woman to an Anglo-Saxon woman. So the Irish were definitely a despised group. And there was a belief that immigrants corrupted America. And nativists, then, were people who saw themselves as the real Americans. They were anti-immigration. Now, this can sometimes be confusing because in the 20th century, we stopped calling American Indians, and we switched to calling American Indians Native Americans. So I could see why this would be confusing, because when you see the word nativist, your initial instinct is probably to think of American Indians. Please do not do that. Nativism refers to Americans who had descendants from England, so Americans who saw themselves as descendants of the original colonists, who felt like people coming over from other parts of the world were corrupting America. So nativists were people who were very anti-immigration. The Irish were especially hated because the Irish were Catholic and the Irish were unskilled laborers. The temperance movement, depending on your motivation, you do see some overlap with the temperance movement and with the anti-immigration movement or nativist movement, because there was an association of immigrants and alcoholism. Therefore, there was a push to outlaw alcohol as kind of an embodiment of being anti-immigration, right? Because Puritans don't drink alcohol. The crazy Irish Catholics do. All right, so of course that is a total stereotype. I'm not saying that's accurate. I'm saying that was the perception. And so one of the reactions to the market revolution and this big influx of Irish working in the factories was the creation of a third party called the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party had a platform of being anti-immigration. And you can see there is their propaganda. Natives of the soil arouse. Shall American labor be protected against foreign competition in the home market? And so this is talking about trying to end foreign immigration. And this was, a major issue of the era. So if you thought that arguments over immigration were new, you are sorely mistaken. Okay, our relationship with immigration has been shaky since we became a country. So I covered a lot in this presentation, but I think it's really important because it's easy to kind of skip over this chunk of time. Jackson people generally pay attention to because, he was a kind of hot-headed president. But it's easy to just go from the era of good feelings to Andrew Jackson to Manifest Destiny to the Civil War. But it's important that you remember these other things that were impacting our country and really changing our identity. The market revolution was a huge part of transforming this country, as were the reform movements. And so it's important to keep what you learned in this presentation in mind as you look at this antebellum period.